is Gonçalo Santos. I'm the coordinator of the PhD program in anthropology. It is indeed my pleasure to welcome once again here at the Department of Life Sciences a distinguished anthropologist and also a new friend, Andrej Grubačić. He is the founding chair of the Anthropology and Social Change Department, and also the editor of the Journal of World Systems Research, and affiliated faculty in residence at the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine at UC Berkeley. He is a well-known anthropologist, anarchist anthropologist, I would say. His interest in world history and anarchist anthropology has influenced tremendously his research perspectives and also his work at California Institute of Integrated Studies in San Francisco, where he is the chair, as I said, of the Department of Anthropology and Social Change. I think it's the first Department of Anthropology and Social Change globally, right? Combining anthropological research with activist research. He has a very long list of publications. I don't like to go very long in presentations of distinguished speakers. I mean, if you want to check out his website, please do. I would probably highlight Living at the Edges of Capitalism, Adventures in Exile and Mutual Aid, published by UC Press, I think sometime in 2017. Yeah. And we have the pleasure also of having him for this academic year here at the University of Coimbra. He's a visiting scholar at the Research Center for Anthropology and Health, CIIS, and also at the Center for Social Studies of the University of Coimbra. Today he's going to talk to us about, well, I suppose some of his core theoretical research interests, combining anthropology, I suppose, and activism. The title of his talk is Beyond Ethnography of Suffering and Anthropology of Good, which takes us straight into the famous paper by Sherry Ortner, Dark Anthropology. Welcome, Andy. The floor is yours.
Thank you. We have crazy weather here in Coimbra. Okay, so thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Gonçalo, and everybody else for inviting me. Now, I'm going to be speaking in English, obviously, so please let me know if I'm going too far, if I'm going too quick, if I'm going too fast, okay? So please feel free to interrupt me at any point, okay? And this essay that Gonçalo mentioned, Sherry Ortner, Dark Anthropology and its others, have you read it? Is it somewhat familiar? Or maybe the predecessor, which is 1984, I think the name was Theory in Anthropological Theory. You have some familiarity with it?
Anthropological theory from the 60s on.
From the 60s on, yes, yeah. Okay. Well, how much time do we have?
We have about 50 minutes, 60 minutes, yeah.
Okay, so you will also have to interrupt me. I'm terrible with time.
Yeah.
So, the reason why I wanted to frame this conversation today around the ideas of Sherry Ortner, who is a good friend and a colleague, is because she has a peculiar gift. She's really very good at diagnosing what is the state of the field, state of the play in anthropology. She's both sort of anthropologist of anthropology and ethnographer of anthropology, of the discipline, meaning she always reveals something that was fairly obvious, but nobody before her actually mentioned it. And the first essay that we mentioned, which was from 1984, was really good, with a particular mode of communication and mode of explanation that left me a little bit confused when I read it for the first time. Namely, what that essay was about, and I'm going to give a very brief digest, is that there was a split in American and English anthropology, but it would be Western anthropology, between the so-called culturalists, also known as idealists, led by Clifford Geertz, who most of you have heard of, the thick description and all of that, Polynesian cockfight and all of these essays, and his students and his colleagues, and they were insisting on the necessity of reading Max Weber and getting all the interesting, juicy stuff from him in explaining culture as a relationship between meaning and culture as something that people, meaning that people give to their activities and their actions, very different than the opposite school. And that was the school of the materialists, which was, she claimed, championed by Eric Wolf, but I would add Sid Mintz as well, who were insisting on relationship between culture and power. And they were criticizing, in my view, justifiably, Clifford Geertz for being somewhat naive about power and thinking about culture as something that exists mostly in text. Power was fairly neglected in the school, and with the exception of Marshall Summits, I'm hard-pressed to think about anybody who wrote about it competently from this school. Nevertheless, my prejudice aside, this was resolved, according to Sherry Ortner, by a sort of an emergence of new body of theory, which happened in the 1980s, and that was usually associated with Pierre Bourdieu. Now, is that any familiar? Bourdieu was, and is usually credited with inventing, coming up with something called practice theory. And it is basically a way of thinking about society and culture as being produced and reproduced, right, through social practice. They were made and unmade through social practice. It was a major break with more constrained choice ideas of human agency, and as such, Sherry Ortner hailed it, welcomed it, is one of the most foundational texts in terms of understanding what she called anthropology of resistance. And then she wrote this essay in 2016, I think it was, and it was confusing because she took a very different mode of explanation. It wasn't anymore academic practice that somehow existed conceptually separated from the economy, from politics, from power. All of a sudden we were treated with the history of something called neoliberalism. Now the phrase is probably familiar to most of you, and it's dominant logic of politics, power, culture in the modern world, at least since the 80s, or I think she would argue since the 90s. And she claims that the birth of neoliberalism, onslaught really of neoliberalism, has engendered a particular kind of anthropology. And she proceeds to call it dark anthropology, with concomitant ethnography of suffering. All of a sudden, she claims, everybody was writing about suffering, doing ethnography of suffering, and power was seemingly everywhere. Everybody was discussing power, everybody was discussing the world, really, in terms of power, domination, exploitation, inequality. It was a confluence, she says, between the colonial turn, Tal-Assad, Anthropology and Colonial Encounter, Edward Said, all of these Orientalism, all of these beautiful works from the 70s, now are in this strange convergence with critiques of neoliberalism. All of a sudden, anthropology becomes dark. And it's an interesting process. She describes it really well. And she says that there are basically two lines to this dark analysis. The first line is the line that goes through Marx. And that's a line that goes to David Harvey, to Jim Ferguson, to people in the discipline that you probably read, Anne Ellison writing about precarious Japan, Jane Collins writing about Walmart and the destruction of working class cultures, and lots of interesting major works really. Now, this is the darkest Marx, she claims. Karl Marx at its darkest. The other dark person involved is Foucault, and Foucault has been extremely instrumental in actually trying to becoming really a template for writing this particular kind of anthropology. Concepts such as governmentality, you're familiar with biopolitics, all of these things, Foucault at its most harsh, most brutal, experimenting with domination and exploitation and writing about it as if there is no exit. Now, dark anthropology she defines it with this ethnography of suffering as the anthropology that is completely, almost exclusively, focused on the most brutal aspects of human existence and structural and historical conditions that underpin this. Both lines of analysis, both dark lines of analysis, Foucault's governmentality, which inspired, say, Ayla Ong, Akhil Gupta, Roger Lancaster, who writes about punitive logic of neoliberalism as the cultural logic of neoliberalism, as something that brings about carceral state of the United States of America. And all of those things, they do emphasize, truly, a pretty grim picture of human possibility under the conditions, and this is where Ortner insists, of neoliberalism. This, in turn, has created a different kind of anthropology. And that's the anthropology of the good. An anthropology of the good is a turn, or maybe a response, or definitely a reaction to the dark anthropology. It was proposed first by Tobias Kelch, who said that there is something that we could call misery porn involving ethnography of suffering. There's something voyeuristic, there's something quasi-pornographic about it. Enough with misery, enough with all of that. Let's talk about something and let's write about something. Let's do ethnography of something that is actually beautiful, that is moral, that has something about value, that says something about care, that says something about well-being. And the first major work is an essay, I'm trying to remember the name of Joel Robbins, it was 2013 or 14. I think it was Beyond the Suffering Subject, Towards an Anthropology of the Good, which served as a sort of a manifesto. It was picked up by many, including Edward Fisher, who wrote about anthropology of well-being. He was doing an ethnography of middle-class, mostly farmers in Guatemala and in Germany. Then was followed by something that we can call happiness turn in anthropology. I know it sounds funky, but actually it was the title of, I think, How Journal published it. Happiness turn and concerns and purpose, something like this. It was all, again, 2013. I think it was Cavedri and Walker who edited it. And they were demanding a positive turn in anthropology. Again, enough with negative anthropology, let's do ethnography of things that actually have something to do with ethics. Which led to our brilliant colleague, Michael Lambeck, and his proposal of something that's called moral turn. So he called for ethical or moral turn in anthropology, and he wrote a really good book collection called Ordinary Ethics, about ordinary people making prudent moral choices in difficult situations. And that is, again, a response mostly, or according to Ortner entirely, to the ethnography of suffering and this dark anthropology. Now, am I going too fast?
Perfect.
Wonderful.
That's good, yeah?
Yeah? Okay, so the last kind of anthropology of the good that she identifies is the anthropology of resistance. And I think this is what Gonzalo thought that I'm going to be talking about today, but not quite. Anthropology of resistance as anthropology of good, according to good anthropology, according to Ortner, involves cultural critique. You're familiar with the term, that Ortner herself does, which has a slight dark bent, because it is also about criticism of power, inequality, exploitation, and all of that. That it also involves rethinking capitalism, and she's probably thinking about people like, well, it's actually hard for me to remember anthropologists who were writing about rethinking capitalism, but I guess Jim Ferguson to an extent, not entirely sure who she meant. She definitely mentioned Harte Negri in the famous book, The Empire. And finally, anthropology of resistance in its most purest form, which is the anthropology of social movements, studying social movements as activists from within, as it were. People that come to mind are Charlie Hale, with his activist anthropology and his book Engaging Contradictions. Then David Graeber and Stephen Choukaitis with their book Constituent Imagination, and of course Jeff Lewis and Alex Kashnavich with their Insurgent Encounters. These are sort of manifestos of this new term in anthropology that is sometimes called the activist term. Now, Sherry Ortner is of course not satisfied with this division. She finds it very simplistic. She likes the good aspects of good anthropology. She also likes the exposition and cultural critique, and activism and anthropology of refusal offered by activist anthropologists. And she then says that the whole history of the discipline really is at a brink, because what we need to do is to find a way to synthesize both. She calls it ethics of probability and ethics of possibility, critique and possibility. And this is what she claims, what keeps anthropology from progressing further. And if you are going to think about the future of our discipline of sociocultural anthropology, we need to think about it deeply, truly through the prism of this synthesis. Now, I mentioned Sherry Ortner because I think that she's really good. But I also think that however accurate this description is, it leaves a lot to be desired. Namely, to say that the future of anthropology depends on this synthesis is to not to go deeply into what I see as the main foundational blocks of anthropological thinking, conceptual blocks that are still not allowing us to think anthropologically beyond what I would call economism, evolutionism, and finally elitism. In order to understand that, we have to go back to a much longer story, and I hope you will have patience to bear with me, which is the story of social sciences. And anthropologists are very good in rethinking. We always have been. We have been terrible in unthinking. And what we really have to do, if we are going to move beyond anthropology of the good and ethnography of suffering, and towards a new kind of anthropology that is actually going to become a part of this broad social movement of social science, and I hope from below, we have to understand what was going on with social sciences in general. We have to understand that structures of knowledge that were created by liberal capitalist modernity are much older than neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is useful, the way that Sherry Ortner is using it, but it's only a very recent part of the story. We are dealing with problems that are much, much older than neoliberalism. So, social sciences, we can define them in many different ways. Let's say, constructed visions of a society that is changing, and as such, they need to be, and they have to be, and from time to time they are reconstructed. The question today for me is, I was just mentioning that I was reading a pretty terrible article in New York Times about 32 of our colleagues in humanities and social sciences being fired, tenured professors. There is a tremendous attack on social sciences and humanities in terms of defunding, in terms of bureaucratization of our work, in terms of attack, direct attack on liberal arts, humanities and social sciences. But the thing is, in this moment of, I would say, both systemic crisis, first of all of historical capitalism, but then also of social sciences, we have to understand how these liberal knowledge structures have been constructed. And you know, the funny thing about social sciences, they're fairly recent. If we go to a period between 1750 and 1850, there were at least 112 names that I was able to find that people used to call different social science disciplines. My favorite is Sir William Jevons, who was an economist, but he didn't know really what he was because there were 15 different names for economics at that time. So he was using the term plutologist. Also a popular term, of course, was political economy, but there was also galactics and chromatics. These are all terms for economy. Eventually, unfortunately, economy prevailed. And it would be fun to call plutologists or plutocrats. But in any case, that was the situation with social sciences that took a long time for them to consolidate. And they were consolidated against two very complicated, complex backgrounds. The first background is something that we might call separation of knowledge systems and birth of C.P. Snow's notion of two cultures. Does that sound familiar? You're not very interactive.
Totally familiar.
C.P. Snow, wonderful Cambridge lectures from 1959. He basically made the argument, that I think is correct, that at the beginning was one knowledge culture that embodied the search for the true, search for the just, search for the good. mostly theological. Most of the knowledge in those days, in Europe at least, was theological. Church was the dominant epistemological authority. Then there was the push from the philosophers. And philosophers tried to push theologians aside. But their arguments were somewhat metaphysical, not very practical, which led to people who were called natural scientists, but not yet, not at that time, to say, enough with philosophy, we need to start thinking about the world of facts, the world of scientific truth, being located in concrete empirical observations. And that is crucial. So natural scientists were able to push philosophers aside. There is an intellectual bandit that I really don't like by the name of Cesare Lombroso. He's an anthropologist. He was fond of saying that political utopians are genetically criminal. You've probably heard of Cesare Lombroso. Now, Lombroso wrote that, and it's a great statement, that we replaced the dreams of metaphysicians and theologians with few dry facts. They're dry, but they're facts. And that was the new ethos. Now, the second complicated but very interesting context for the development of modern social science was the French Revolution. And the Great Revolution was important because it created three things, really, three results. First, it completely normalized the idea of social change. Second, it created this idea, this entity that we call the people, which had the sovereignty. And finally, created the modern nation state as the only proper channel, forum, space, political space, where any kind of social change can be enacted. Now, liberalism, or centrist liberalism, became the dominant ideology of the modern capitalism, of the liberal modernity, and it asserted its dominance in four main spheres of life. First, it invented a modern nation state. Second, a very exclusive concept of citizenship, and exclusive of working classes, of women, of ethnic and racial others. Third, the modern construct of private property. And fourth, intimately connected to universities, the emergence of social sciences. And social sciences, as a social, organized research of the social world, were distinct from humanities on one side and from natural sciences on the other side. But social sciences at the beginning were outside of the university. They truly were a social movement that existed from above more than from below, for liberal reform. So when you read Condorcet, when you read Mirabeau, when you read especially Herbert Spencer, you will see that the way that they spoke of social scientists and social science is a sort of social art of social regulation. Herbert Spencer has a famous quote when he says that the truth of social science is regeneration of the existing order. So they had this practical role. And they were created again outside of the universities that were not in existence yet, and they were created in places called social science associations. The first one that I was able to find was Manchester Statistical Social Science Association, then there was a Just Social Science Association, and then American Social Science Association. Soon this was so successful, this liberal reform social movement for social science, that a group of professionals claim that they need a new kind of academic, disciplinarian, intellectual, organizational space, and that social, newly won social space was the space of the university. That was the invention of the modern university. And modern university, in that sense, again, took a few years or decades to be established. I think that Oxford adopted the statutes in 1800 and 1817, so it took them a while. And it basically meant a complete break with the tradition of medieval university. These were fully paid scholars with a day job, as they say in the United States, people who worked in the disciplines, and discipline itself was defined as a vocabulary plus organization plus journal plus a conference. And all of a sudden you had very stable social science disciplines. Now these disciplines, again, were intimately related to the universities, because the idea of modern nation state was to create a stable national identity. In order to create a stable national identity, it had to do two things: to secure the present and to secure the past. In order to secure the past, we had to invent, or they had to invent, people called the historians. Now, this is the birth of professional history. Historians were sent to the archives basically to invent the past of new modern states. And especially after the Paris Commune, 1871, they were entrusted with, as Eric Hobsbawm famously argued, with created the idea of the Republic in order to fight off the working classes. Now, in order to stabilize the present, 3 other social sciences were invented, sociology, economy, and political science. In order to explain what people who haven't made the evolutionary leap into modernity were doing, anthropologists were invented and Oriental studies were invented. Soon there was a completely new organization, of liberal organization of knowledge, according to West and the rest, according to the past and the present, and according to the liberal organization of politics, which involved society, studied by sociologists, market, studied by economists, and of course the state, studied by political scientists. Now, this was, as you can see, intimately related, not coincidentally, but intimately existentially related to the triumph of the new political, theoretical, intellectual common sense that had 3 main key ideas. First is what I call elitism, what Haskell calls the community of the competent, what Jacques Rancière, French philosopher, calls the logic of the police. Namely, the idea that the role of social science is to be the community of the competent. Competent people managing common affairs, right? The second problem, and the second key staple of liberalism, geoculture of liberalism, is the idea of evolutionism. Slow, gradual, stadial movement through stages, identified with progress that ends with modern nation state. And finally, we have economism. The idea basically that we are all driven by this desire to maximize utility, pleasures, material possessions, what have you, and that every human interactions can be explained in the terms and language of the market. Now, these cut very deep, and these have created scars from which anthropology and social science and other social sciences are still recovering from. They did not come without resistance, and I would like to mention a few people who leveled actually incredibly interesting existence. One was a Native American indigenous statesman by the name of Kandi Arok. Name sounds familiar? 1680, he confronted the chief of, well, the colonial administrator in Quebec. And Kandi Arok actually had a fairly good knowledge of Europe. He traveled Europe, he knew Europe really well, he spoke the languages. And the debate was really interesting, and the notes were taken by certain Lahontan. And the debate was about, the main argument that Kandi Arok had, is that he said basically, you Europeans have a problem, because you think that everything comes from some fundamental problem in human nature, some fundamental flaw of human nature. That's ridiculous. You have all these institutions like money and private property that actually create the necessity for coercive institutions. There is and there can be no meaningful freedom without meaningful equality. And this became a book. Lahontan published it, it became a play, it became widely imitated by many, many Enlightenment thinkers, including a certain Madame Gaffini, who was a Saloniste, and who was a friend with Turgot, who you, of course, know as one of the major figures in social science and philosophy. Now, she wrote a sort of an indigenous critique of European society from the perspective of an Inca princess. Remember, this was a hugely important genre in Enlightenment, during the Enlightenment years. So, in her book, the Inca princess comes to a place, I think it was England, and says, well, look at this doesn't make any sense. Why don't you just redistribute all of this wealth? So it was the first probably feminist, but also social democratic critique of European society coming from an indigenous person, fictional. Now, she said this to Turgot, and they were very close, and Turgot said, well, this is all well and fine, but there is a big problem. Everybody loves freedom and equality, but not everybody can have it. We all move through stages, and commercial development and commercial civilization, if it's more sophisticated, demands more sophisticated division of labor. he basically, in this very informal letter, defined what was to become social evolutionism, stadialism, the idea that we all move through stages of history, and end with this Hegelian, nonsensical monstrosity that is the modern nation state. Now, the whole genre then, the whole intervention, was really an attempt to diffuse the indigenous critique of European society, which I think is pretty remarkable. The other story is also remarkable, and it goes back to Mikhail Bakunin, who was a Russian revolutionary scholar who wrote in the 1860s a book called God and the State. And the book was critique of what he called the political theology. And he said, listen, you liberals have this idea of rule of law, of what political scientists actually call decisionism, where basically it is a political, secularized version of a theological argument. God creates morality only because he can stand outside of it. You are saying that statesmen and politicians do the same. That made political scientists extremely angry. There were many books written about this, and probably the worst one and the most important one is a book by a Nazi theorist by the name of Carl Schmitt, who wrote the entire book as a rant, really, and as an attack against Bakunin. And he actually called it political theology. So that was really interesting. And as I was going through all of these things and challenges to this newly universal, soon to be universal common sense, I also discovered my favorite author, an anthropologist and geographer, and that's Piotr Kropotkin. Now, Prince Kropotkin, is that a name that rings a bell? Mutual Aid? Mutual Aid was published in 1902. And 1902 was a momentous year in that if social evolution started as a theory in order to diffuse the indigenous criticism, it soon became extremely violent. And Herbert Spencer, whom I already mentioned, created this term of survival of the fittest because he tried to explain the entire social evolution in terms of conquest, genocide, in terms of this very Hobbesian struggle for survival. And Darwin himself actually used that term first. If Herbert Spencer coined it in 1852, Darwin must have used it in the 1860s, so much later. And Darwinian or Darwinism was further banalized, trivialized, and made into this bloodthirsty sport of competition by people like Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, Alfred Wallace, whom am I forgetting in this crowd? Well, in any case, a lot of them, some of them economists. And Kropotkin basically was saying, no, enough. And the main thing that he did really was to say that not competition, but solidarity and mutual aid is as decisive factor in natural selection as is competition. And what he did that was different than his friends from so-called the Russian school of evolutionary, it was slightly different than Darwin. He brought about humanity and struggle of humanity, not only about nature. And because he did that, he could not be ignored. The reaction was extremely violent. He wrote, I mean, these were beautiful sentences, and if I can find it, I can read you one. This is a famous chapter for mutual aid. Yeah. It is not love, and not even sympathy, understood in its proper sense, which induces a herd of horses to form a ring in order to resist an attack of wolves. It is a feeling infinitely wider than love or personal sympathy, an instinct that has been slowly developing among animals and men in the course of an extremely long evolution, and which has taught animals and men alike the force they can borrow from the practice of mutual aid and support, and the joys they can find in social life. It is not love, and not even sympathy, upon which society is based in mankind. It is a consciousness, be it only at the stage of an instinct of human solidarity. It is unconscious recognition of the force that is borrowed by each man from the practice of mutual aid, of the close dependence of everyone's happiness upon the happiness of all, and of all sense of justice or equity, which brings the individual to consider the rights of every other individual as equal to his own. Upon this broad and necessary foundation, the still higher moral feelings are developed. Kropotkin's conclusion was that mutual aid is the core of human sociability. And his wonderment, puzzlement, was why are Darwinists, this kind of this Darwinian sense, Darwinian common sense, why were they insisting so much on trying to understand every single human action as production of the result of some kind of selfishness? Why was any form of being whimsical, playful, bloody, why is this always something that is selfish? And consider the reaction. There were two fields in sciences that were created to answer Kropotkin. One is evolutionary psychology, the other is social biology. What they were trying to do, basically, was to reconcile Kropotkin's idea about cooperation in the natural world with this idea that our behavior is ultimately behavior driven by what Dawkins was ultimately to call the selfish genes. The famous biologist, the name now escapes me, Holden, I think, who said that he would give his life for his 2 brothers, 4 half-brothers, and 8 first cousins. It was all a sort of a calculus, scientific response to Kropotkin in defense of this newly defined economism. That was attacked a few years after Kropotkin was already dead by an anthropologist by the name of Marcel Mauss, who probably single-handedly invented French anthropology, who was also a nephew of Emile Durkheim, famous French sociologist, and whose, I mean, it's interesting to remember this. Anthony Giddens, I found this in his book, he says that Durkheim was somebody who spent his entire life fighting for political liberalism against twin challenges of socialism on one side and conservatism on the other. I think that's quite correct. But his nephew, Marcel Mauss, was a socialist. He was a socialist of the kind that became very enthusiastic about the Russian Bolshevik Revolution and then terribly disappointed. He, and we usually forget this, that he wrote his famous book, The Gift, probably the most famous book in 1925, as a direct response to Lenin. He was looking for and trying to understand what was happening with the new economic policy in Soviet Russia, and he discovered that this is, he called it the cynical play. There was nothing there, he said, but the rational calculus of the market transposed to politics. And then he brought all of his research on ethnography and history and so forth in order to try to understand how this happened. And I think this is actually quite brilliant. What he understood and what he discovered, and this of course would not surprise Kropotkin in the least, was that everything that we heard from the economists about economic history has been completely flawed. There was the usual story, you know it. In the beginning was the barter, then barter became a little bit complicated, then money was invented as a medium of universal exchange, then that became a little bit too messy, then we had banks and more technologically sophisticated forms of exchange and all of that. Well, what Marcel Mauss discovered is none of that really existed. All over where anthropologists were looking, they were finding economies in which people, which should probably not be called economies at all, in which people were exchanging objects as gifts in order to create a relationship, which was the entire point. He was emphasizing this joy and pleasure of giving and receiving, saying that this is really not about the moral calculus. This is about creating a relationship where self-interest doesn't exist. He even told you, and I think it was in his ethnographic notebooks, that self-interest cannot be translated in most human languages. Because what the gift does, it creates a relationship that both enhances the individual and the society as a whole. And that was a Maussian insight that was later developed by another French anthropologist by the name of Pierre Plaster. Now, Pierre Plaster, I don't know if that name is familiar, political anthropologist, decided to attack straight on the idea of social evolutionism and the idea of necessity of the modern state as a sort of pinnacle of human development. And he went to research in Amazonia and discovered all of these political mechanisms, inbuilt political mechanisms in state-free, or stateless, but state-free societies, in which people were actually discovering the conversion of what he was calling the coercive power, or non-coercive power, into coercive power. is a strikingly similar argument to the one that Moss made, when he said that gift economies encourage entrepreneurs, but they do have an inbuilt mechanism that prevents permanent wealth inequalities to be created. Now, I gave you a few ideas of the attack on this emerging common sense on three ideas that are inbuilt ideas of liberal modernity, including economism, evolutionism, and elitism, management of the common affairs again by the people who are competent, whom social scientists either advise or serve. And these challenges were unfortunately diffused, dealt with. So the moment we enter the 1930s, say, we have a very stable research university with this tripartite structure of natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities. And we have liberal structures of knowledge organized into discipline pretty much intact, but not completely. And the first major structural challenge to the disciplines and the modern organization of knowledge comes after the Second World War in the shape and form of area studies. Now, the new geopolitics of the Cold War required a new kind of regional knowledge, and it helped anthropology and Oriental studies lose the kind of legitimacy that they had until that time. Something new was needed. The new push, and probably much stronger push, came in 1968. The World Revolution of 1968 pushed social science disciplines in this very self-critical, fiercely critical, really, direction that completely destabilized the project of social science, the liberal project of social sciences as a whole. And this is, of course, a period that Sherry Ortner writes about in her 1984 essay. Now, after that, there is the offensive of the global right, and of course you have neoliberalism, the context of Ortner's second essay, that is all about defunding and destroying not only liberal arts and social sciences and humanities, but also the idea, the existence of university as such. And if the period after the Second World War was the period of unprecedented expansion of modern universities in the world, period that we live in right now is a period university as this principal locus of production and reproduction of knowledge is in great danger. And actually it's a good question, and I have no good answer to it if it is going to survive. But what is clear, more than I think at any time before, is that social sciences as a project are in serious crisis. And now we are again faced with a question. If social sciences are going to be organized or reorganized, and that they will, by whom and for what? Is it going to be again a social movement for liberal or conservative or right-wing reform that comes from above? Or is it going to be a different kind of social movement that comes from below and that fights for a growth that is more just, that is more equal, that is more sensible, that is more reasonable? Now this is entirely up to us and entirely up to anthropology. And anthropology and anthropologists, if they want to participate in this new politics of social sciences, have to deal with economism, evolutionism, and elitism. It is so deeply ingrained in the way that they think. Take Bourdieu. Bourdieu is always a sort of a hero of Sherry Ortner's essays, right? But I don't know if you have read his book on the Algiers and Kabyle in the Algiers, his reinterpretation of the gift. It's frightening. He begins with a quotation of Moss. Moss defines gift on the first page of the book. And he says it's a prestation that invites a fake pretense of pure generosity in order to create relationships. He doesn't say much more than that, but he is very clear that this is not a way to defeat your opponent by scoring moral, or symbolic, or material victory. Right? Bourdieu is somehow able to read this in a completely different way in order to say that theory always shows that in practice what people do is try to outmaneuver each other, and for that purpose they use gifts. Gift, he says, is a part of a dominance or a game of dominance in which through a set of strategies. We increase our symbolic capital in order to convert it into an advantage in which we can defeat the party that we are facing. Now, how is this different than economics? This is economics pure and simple, hidden in critical social theory of one of the most progressive social scientists in the world. So economism is very much with us. So is social evolutionism in slightly modified form, of course, but it's still here. I had to study sociology, and I mean developmentalism and all of those things there are still very much present, and as they are in anthropology. So I think that anthropologists have a lot to give. What we have been doing throughout all of those decades of the discipline has been creating a very important social compendium of political, social, and other possibilities. We have actually studied societies that live without a market, societies that live with functional government without a state, actually existing communistic society, if you will. And all of this has been complemented by the technique that was perfected by anthropologists, that is ethnography. And ethnography is fabulous. So, insisting on this, making sure that we are in contact with people who are from other social sciences on the same task, trying to create a new kind of social science, and really a new kind of scientia, new kind of knowledge that will build and bring together knowledge as a search pursuit for truth, and knowledge as a pursuit of just society. And create really a common sense of a new kind that's going to be beyond economism, beyond elitism, beyond evolutionism. That, I think, is the task of anthropology, and this is, I would like this to be the next essay that Sherry Ortner is going to write. Thank you, and if you have any questions, it would be lovely to hear them.